Goblins.
Do you think you could beat a goblin in a fight?
No.
Probably not.
Oh yeah, I kicked the shit out of it.
I've fallen down a bit of a rabbit hole recently.
See that 93% of those who voted in the poll voted for Goblin mode.
Because here's the thing. One wouldn't expect an imaginary little creature from the 12th century to still hold relevance in modern society. And yet...
Goblins.
The word of the year is, quote, Goblin mode?
So what is it about these freaky dudes that have kept them a fixture of popular culture? And what does it say about the human condition?
Cheddar Goblin!
So, the first problem is a lack of data. Traditional folkloric models of goblins as ill-intentioned sprites are fairly well documented. But to understand modern perceptions of the tiny fellows, I'm gonna have to ask some strange questions. What color do you associate with goblins?
It's green.
Green.
Like a light green.
For some reason, I think green.
Using a list of 16 curated goblin questions, I interviewed other YouTube creators, and anyone I could corner, to fill in a collective mental portrait of the contemporary goblin.
So, sharp teeth.
Floppy ears.
I think of tricksters.
Goofy little guys.
Tiny little streaks of hair. I could also just be thinking about Yoda.
And pretty quickly, an unexpected pattern emerged. That being that people have very strong opinions on what goblins are and aren't.
Goblins can have fur.
No.
Absolutely, goblins can have fur.
Which is interesting, because, well, goblins aren't real. That's something everyone I interviewed agreed on. So why does such a strong mental image of them live in our minds? What seemingly vital role are they filling in our society?
That's more than enough, you ghoulish goblin. Spider-Man.
Conventional wisdom would put goblins in the category of monster, and anthropologically speaking, nearly all mythic monsters represent a dominant fear. Here's the problem. The question of, would you be frightened by a goblin, was met with fairly mixed responses.
I think both yes and no.
Sort of depends on how many of them there are.
Yes, I'm terrified of monkeys.
It does seem reasonable to be apprehensive towards an entity with malicious intent, and even the looser interpretations of goblins tend to act violently.
Have some gremlin dust.
But unlike almost every other folkloric monster, there's also seemingly a sense that when it comes down to it, goblins are kind of pushovers. When I asked people if they thought they could defeat a goblin, most said yes, and a lot of initial no's turned into maybes upon reflection.
Yes, but can you catch it?
I'd probably be able to get a few solid, punches in.
If you're in the forest, then it might be harder to defeat. But if it's in my house, I'm kicking it to death.
This just doesn't fit with the typical terror-instilling model of monsterhood. So if goblins aren't conventional monsters, what are they? Time to dig deeper.
Down to goblin, down.
So tracing backwards, in 1937, Tolkien dropped a banger called The Hobbit, which helped establish goblins as they're most often depicted today. In conjunction with The Lord of the Rings, these books help found concepts like how goblins are evil's most basic foot soldiers, how they use crude weaponry, how they come from the mud and slime.
The goblin birthing pits, your majesties.
I'm being born.
That's pretty neat.
However, Tolkien's goblins were still physically formidable. It might surprise you to hear that the original books made no distinction between goblins and orcs. Those were just two names for the same entity. But to avoid confusion, the Jackson films decided to treat them as two distinct creatures, helping to cement goblins as the lesser, more easily dispatched cannon fodder they're now often treated as.
Dear Magic the Gathering, I'm returning your stupid goblin card. He's weak.
The idea that goblins are the puniest of the puny, the level 1 enemies of fantasy, has been further spread by video games and RPGs.
They're the butt of the joke, the easiest thing to kill, whatever.
Sorry lads, but have goblins always been this way? The other most obvious archetype to slot goblins into is that of the trickster figure. The pre-Tolkien goblins of medieval Europe were often depicted as greedy fae folk who manipulated people into bad deals.
Okay, who took my watch?
Some of this is historically linked to appalling anti-Semitism, though Goblin Tricksters in folklore spring from broader sources than these destructive caricatures. Many global cultures tell of creatures that could be classified as goblin adjacent, and though one should hesitate before assigning the term goblin to disparate figures, there's ultimately strong evidence that devious little mischief makers are a cultural universal.
Flip this table!
But much like how goblins failed to be as frightening as a traditional monster, they don't seem as skilled at deceiving people as the traditional trickster. Would you trust a goblin to keep its promise?
Of course not. No.
All of these types of creatures are associated with being tricksters.
If some random human on the street was like, if you get me this magical staff, I'll give you a giant pile of gold, I'd probably be like, no.
And this isn't necessarily a modern shift. Tallying up various tales, goblins in folklore rarely succeeded at outwitting their targets. They honestly have more in common with the villains of slapstick cartoons than the traditional tricksters of mythology. They seem less the coyote of indigenous American tradition and more the coyote of a Roadrunner short.
Hold your ground!
So if goblins aren't traditional monsters or tricksters, what role are they serving? Well, at this point in my research process, I had one more idea. There is a long history of house sprites, often labeled as goblins, being used to rationalize why household objects so often go missing.
Trolls exist! They steal your socks, but only the left ones. What's with that?
These sorts of legends likely serve to make mundane misfortunes more exciting, so I figured maybe that idea still holds true. Would you be excited if a goblin was behind an object disappearing?
I'd be kind of freaked out.
I would not be excited at all.
That would ruin my life. How would you ever recover?
Huh. Okay, so sounded like a no on that explanation. I needed to change tactics. I figured it was possible that a lack of a concrete definition for goblin was skewing my results. After all, historically the term was something of a catch-all. There was no clear division between things like gnomes, fairies, and goblins. So I devised a test to see if that's still the case, and the results were...
That's a goblin.
A goblin.
A goblin.
Definitely could be a goblin.
That's gotta be a gnome.
That's a garden gnome.
Well, that's gotta be a fairy.
He looks, oh wait, no, I didn't see the wings. The wings scream fairy.
A goblin. Number 2 is a garden gnome.
This is a goblin.
And number 3 is a fairy.
Goblin, gnome, fairy.
So yeah, everyone knew what a goblin was. Even my attempts at tricking folks with the least goblin-looking goblin I could think of.
So that's David Bowie.
Okay, that's just David Bowie.
Still didn't work.
He was the Goblin King in that, right?
Absolutely.
The babe with the power. Power of voodoo.
Evidently, everyone interviewed had a clear mental image of goblins, yet I was no closer to figuring out why goblins are so enduring. But I could get to the bottom of this. I had to.
Can I ask what made you want to ask this question?
My interest in goblins is not a recent development. In fact, what inspired me to make this video is a hypothetical that I used to spring on people when I was younger, for reasons that now escape me. It goes like this. Say you're walking with a friend late at night, and a goblin leapt from their pocket. Then said goblin stole your ear. What's your immediate reaction?
There's so much happening.
Extreme confusion.
So I'd be like standing there with blood coming out of the side of my head.
It would fundamentally shake my understanding of how the entire universe works.
This question is, admittedly, pretty deranged, and yet I've kept asking it because I keep getting different answers.
I think my first impulse would be to interrogate my friend. I'd be like, did you know?
My reaction would be to confront it or chase after it.
Silly as it may be, people engage with this hypothetical extremely thoroughly. There is something about it that captures the imagination.
It would feel like my entire life was a lie.
It totally depends on so many things. Do I get my ear back? Is my friend a sorcerer or not? Can I learn magic is a big one.
I accept that this question is messy and bizarre, but I think that's why I've always enjoyed asking it, always delighted in the strange answers, always craved that feeling of going goblin mode.
Why do people enter goblin mode? Because look at the studies.
Sometimes the answers have been staring you in the face all along. In 2022, Goblin Mode, defined as the rejection of societal expectations in a hedonistic manner, was named Oxford Dictionary's Word of the Year. At the time, I was glad to have my unhinged fascination with the creatures be somewhat validated, but it wasn't until late into making this video that I considered the significance of this trend. Because it's a pretty big shift, right? To see goblins as aspirational, to seek to emulate their greedy, messy, and chaotic lifestyle.
No one can tell me no!
In a way, it seems bewildering, if not downright ill-advised, and in a way, it seems completely logical.
It's a response to this idea of on social media, everyone's, putting on makeup all the time, making things look so good.
If I've concluded one thing from my research, it's that goblins are folklorically destined to be failures. Failed monsters, failed fighters, failed tricksters. But wouldn't that take the pressure off if your narrative burden was not to be a protagonist, but some unimportant, skulking creature unencumbered by lofty expectations? Now more than ever, there is pressure on humans to be perfect. Perfect in a way that ignores the fact that we, at our core, are creatures. In our current culture, to live without performance, to accept one's own visceral oddities, has become something of a radical act. So is it any wonder one might find philosophical solace in those iconic little freaks?
People want to be happier, so they're going Goblin Mode.
I have to wonder if that, more than any other factor, is what has made the goblin archetype so enduring. The simple joy of seeing a gross, feral creature and thinking to yourself, that would be nice. And okay, I cannot say with any confidence that when ancient people looked at depictions of goblins, they saw a cathartic embodiment of the id. Maybe they looked at goblins and just went, ah! But I do know this. I am something of a reserved person in my personal life, who would rather miss a bus than ask someone when the next one comes. So where did I find the energy to ask a bunch of very patient people such bizarre questions? Was that my inner goblin manifesting, working through me, ignoring social guidelines? And seeing how everyone I interviewed had fun, is it such a bad thing to occasionally indulge one's inner goblin? I've been wondering lately if goblins have even more to teach us. Deep into the rabbit hole of research, I discovered the Goblin Core subreddit, which to my surprise was not filled with images of tiny gremlins, but instead snapshots of mushrooms and moss. Even more surprising was that it was a community of over 100,000 people. Goblin Core, as it turns out, is defined as a subculture inspired by the folklore of goblins centered on an appreciation of natural ecosystems not typically considered beautiful. And though I was vaguely familiar with the concept, as was the case with Goblin Mode, I had never considered its full social significance. Cause in the same way the more goblinish parts of ourselves are often suppressed, we have a habit of undervaluing certain parts of the natural world for being too strange or slimy. The reality of nature as a creeping, wriggling, writhing thing is one people have historically had trouble confronting. In this way, mushrooms are the perfect representation of this trend. Aside from possessing a certain je ne sais quoi of goblinness, you know what I'm talking about. In the Middle Ages, fungus was associated with devious fey creatures, with rings of mushrooms considered the gathering place of otherworldly spirits. With the role they play in breaking down dead matter and their potential to be poisonous, it is in some ways understandable that such life forms would be the impetus for various dark legends. But mushrooms, like most aspects of the natural world, are not deontologically evil. In fact, they play a critical role in the health of most ecosystems. Their task of decomposition might not be pleasant, but the unpleasantries of nature are no less important. They might even be worth placing on a pedestal. As our culture has reevaluated the value of things which are goblin adjacent, perhaps it should come as no surprise that depictions of goblins themselves have gone through a quiet renaissance. From Dungeons and Dragons to video games, more sympathetic portraits of goblins seem to be emerging. And if you're familiar with the arc most historical monsters have followed, this shouldn't come as a surprise. I've discussed before how the longer a monster exists as a cultural touchstone, the more likely it is that creative works will emerge that consider said creature's perspective. This is probably the natural result of human empathy, where the more one is exposed to depictions of a non-human entity, the more likely it is they'll find something relatable about them. I actually remember the very moment this happened to me vis-a-vis goblins.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
So, there's this scene in the Two Towers where a group of goblins, in this version orcs, are debating with the Uruk-hai whether or not they can eat the hobbits. It's a pretty freaky sequence, and not one that necessarily invites you to consider the social complexities of the monsters involved. But as the scene wraps up, an orc disobeys orders, and the lead Uruk-hai beheads him and says,
"Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys."
Okay, I know it sounds trivial, but this line really threw me when I was younger. Because orcs have menus? They understand the concept of ordering cuisine based on personal preference? It just brought up so many questions. Are there orc restaurants that they go to after assailing Middle-earth? Do they have a tipping culture? And if these menus are a written list, does that mean there's orc literacy? Is there a market in Mordor for, like, orc books? I recognize that pondering the potential intricacies of orc culture is not the point of this scene. Right after the line drop, all the orcs straight up eat the dead one. But I think questions of orc-goblin complexity is a natural byproduct of how much time the films spend with them. Like, I also love the scene where an orc argues with Saruman over realistic production output like a beleaguered HR rep.
I want them armed and ready to march within 2 weeks.
But my lord, there are too many. They cannot all be armed in time. We don't have the means.
And I think it's telling that the internet has taken note of how relatable the scene is. I obviously don't approve of Mordor, but an orc or goblin's lot in life is not irrelevant to us. Even though new cultural conceptions of goblins and goblinness have begun to emerge, I wasn't entirely sure what those I interviewed would make of sympathetic goblins. Do you think a goblin could be friendly?
The possibility of them not being friendly seems like weirder to me.
I could befriend one of them the same way I could imagine befriending a soot sprite out of a Miyazaki film.
If I was friends with a goblin for a really long time and I asked him, like, can you help me move this weekend? And he was like, yeah, I'll be there, I promise. I would like to think I could trust him.
Clearly, more complex portraits of goblins have entered the public consciousness. However, it's equally notable that people object to goblin depictions that are overly tame.
It's like someone took a goblin and left it in a glass of water for like a week and everything was worn away. It's the river-smoothed stone of goblins.
Ultimately, I think the fouler, more visceral side of goblins is part of what makes them special, even as we reassess whether they should serve as cautionary tales or lifestyle inspiration. Goblins can, and perhaps should, contain multitudes.
I started meditating and doing yoga. Now I can see with my heart and smell with my soul.
There's a goblin that lives in each of our heads. A feral being, unbound by perfectionism, accepting of failure, content to be a creature. And maybe that's a good thing, even a vital thing. To be able to accept that sometimes what one really needs is to nap, scratch oneself, and eat 200 pretzels. To be able to appreciate the unusual, untraditional aspects of the world. To be able to get a strange, authentic joy out of collecting objects of no particular value and calling it a hoard. All of these are paths towards accepting one's inner self. Perhaps it is no great mystery why goblins are so widespread. Perhaps there are 8.2 billion of them. Also, in terms of smaller numbers that mean the absolute world to me, this channel recently passed 1 million subscribers, which I truly cannot believe. I still run the channel as a one-person show, and I cannot express how unbelievably grateful I am to everyone who has tuned in to this little corner of the internet. I seriously cannot thank all of you enough. And also, shout out to the creators I interviewed in this video, Tail Foundry, Quinn's Ideas, The Octopus Lady, and KH Anubis. They were so great and thoughtful, and everyone should go check out their amazing channels. Links are in the description. Also, thank you to all my friends and family that let me interview them about goblins for hours. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this entry, please lend your support by liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon to stay up to date on all things curious, because I've got a lot of exciting things planned for the future. See you in the next video.
Goblins! Goblins! Goblin!
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblin! Goblin!
Goblins.
Goblin.
Goblin! Goblin!
Goblins! Goblin! Goblin! Goblin!
Goblins.
Goblin! Goblin!
Goblins.
Goblins!
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblin.
Goblin?
Goblin. Goblin. Goblin.
Goblin.
The Goblins?